To rule or not to rule, so pondered the great thinkers. Plato championed the rule of men, which is the idea that an exceptional person, guided by virtue and value, can rule better than laws. Is this true, do you think? We live in a world where we, humanity, have given away our power to presidents, priests, politicians, and CEOs, where we are subject to what they think is best for us, what they deem acceptable, and what they think is for the greater good. The question now, under the light of this full moon, is how long before the ruling structures break? Hey there, Truth Seeker. Welcome to the Star Kittens community where we discuss 13 sign astrology. Are you in alignment with your divine design? Do you want to master the metaphysical reality? Open the doors of perception. Each planetary body is an archetype, a template, if you will, that helps us interpret human behavior and the world around us. The more awake and aware we are, the more synchronicity will show up in your life. Our focus today is the Gemini full moon. We will spotlight and interpret the extremely rare Grand Cross formation involving the Sun, Moon, Chiron, Arcturus, and Zeus, and a potent T-square with Mars at the focal point. To help us reach more souls with this important message, please like, share, and subscribe. There's a lot going on, so let's jump in. Happy New Year, David.
Yes, Happy New Year to you too.
And all our listeners and subscribers. Thank you for tuning in this new year, season 4 of our videos on YouTube, which is very exciting. And we're being blessed with a beautiful, rare formation in the night sky, a Grand Cross, which we will go over. But I just want to ask you, David, what do you see 2025 in Star Kittens Media? How do you see it come this year?
2025. I don't really know what you're asking. Are you asking me to start the blog or are you
No, I'm
asking me?
asking you, how do you see Star Kittens? Is this the 4th season, 2025, new year? Do you see excitement? Do you see keep going with how we're doing things? What is your kind of intuition telling you?
Uh, well, 2025 is when we add up the numbers, it's a 9 year. So for that reason alone, it feels like it's the end of something, of a cycle that's been going for a while and the beginning of something new as well. So in the context of Star Kittens and what we've been doing for the last 3 years, I think it is, maybe longer than that. This feels like a turning point for us, and I'm really looking forward to particularly this, what the cosmos has dished up for us at this very first reading of the year. Is pretty exciting, and I think that will set the theme and the tone. This reading will set the theme and tone for the rest of the year because it's very clear the messages that are coming through.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's not summer here today. It doesn't feel like summer, but it does seem like there's this vibrancy around us. Here in New Zealand, of course, we're in the summer season, and our veggie garden has had so much rain that I just pulled out, I think 5 cucumbers and 4 zucchinis that have grown into marrows. So abundance. I feel abundance and freedom. It's exciting. So let's turn to today's reading. It's the full moon occurring here in New Zealand on the 14th of January. The sun is still very much in Sagittarius, and the moon is on the opposite side in Gemini. So what is the overview?
Governance is the key word. When I first looked at the chart, that just hit me immediately. And it was interesting that you and I were talking about governance at our New Year's. We were reflecting on this whole idea of what is governance and self-rule and being ruled over and so on and so forth. And we were debating the merits of that. And that was before even seeing the chart that you printed out. So obviously I picked something up in the field, as it were, and here we are. So governance is, because this is the first reading, I feel that this really sets the tone, the broad tone for the rest of the year. Rulers, controllers, directors, leaders, managers, presidents, kings, all symbolized by the archetype of Zeus, which is very prominent at this full moon, particularly in this grand square. And we will show that on the screen because it's a quite a interesting astrological configuration. And bearing in mind that, the universal intelligence, the cosmos has played these cards for us, and we're simply doing an interpretation of that. But when it comes to governance, what we're really talking about here is, what is our relationship with these people that are in these positions of power? What is our relationship with them? Now, given that this full moon is in Gemini, Gemini is very binary, and therefore reasonably easy to interpret because it's kind of the two pillars represent either one way or the other. So, in the context of governance and rulers and our relationship with these people, whether they be elected or self-appointed, by the way, the Gemini energy is about pillars, two pillars, or effectively polarity. So, there are always, under Gemini influences, whether they be full moons or new moons, there's two issues, and I've written them down as empowerment and disempowerment, autonomy versus impotence, agency versus subservience, colonialism versus repatriation, self-governance versus hegemony. Just as some examples of the two sides of governance. 2025 begins with an astrological boom. Effectively, a rare grand cross is dished up for us. So exciting to be doing a reading on this. But rare grand crosses, or these grand crosses, contain, this one anyway, contains the seeds of an urgent and strong message for us individually and collectively. And that is the message of choice, Gemini. We are being asked to pick a path, a team, a direction. Gemini is also about communication, broadcasting, and media. So there is going to be a lot of noise. The loudest voice, there's going to be mis and disinformation in our view. There's going to be conflicts that play out in the public square and on social media. There's a Mars energy here, which is very strong as well, which implies that these communications, these messages about governance and coming from the rulers, coming from the overlords, coming from the presidents, coming from the priests, coming from the CEOs and those in power, Mars messages implies that they will be strident, they will be over the top, there will be a lot of drama, and they will be forceful. There will be a lot of rhetoric and posturing from prominent figures, and they will be attempting to impose their views. So I'm expecting a lot of argumentative discourse in the public domain. There'll be a lot of overly intellectual analysis. That's the Gemini energy. The Mars energy is about aggressive messages and communications. And when Mars is sitting right next to the moon, as he is, this will be strongly emotional as well. So there will be competitive jockeying for position in terms of capturing our eyeballs and our attention. The differences and the messages coming through under this Gemini full moon about governance will be stark They will be clear. They will be as obvious as dark and light. And the encouragement in the middle of all of that is to start small with your communications and your discussions, your debates. Be really clear in your communication with one another about governance, and we will touch on and get into that a little bit more in a moment. But be discerning, be open to ideas, and there's going to be a smorgasbord of communication at this full moon. Some of it is going to be very triggering. Some of it will be meh and a little off-putting, and some of it will be highly, highly inspiring and encouraging and insightful. So trawl the internet, look at YouTube, be aware that in that period beginning from the 14th of January that there's going to be a lot of communication coming into the field and into the public square about this idea of governance.
Mm. And just to go back to the reading we did last month, last year even, where we also very much spoke about Gemini and um, how our childhood exposure to everything that we experience really sets up our beliefs. And so you'll have people that grew up with a very strict childhood, authoritarian, and you have respect for your elder. And there would have been other people that were totally let loose, and that could have made or broke them. It makes or breaks you by having that responsibility from a really young age. Sink or swim is another term that we like to use. And the communication that we use now, so much stems from that. But I had a situation happen to me, and it kind of ties in with this. It's how we carry out our communication. You could be extremely frustrated by something that happened to you or in your workplace, and it is how do you handle that? How do you communicate that frustration? And I think a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people will ripple out something that's quite negative, will be quite low vibrational. And I like to just talk to the people that recognize that, to kind of go, be the bigger person. When you're communicating, have your cup empty so that you can meet people where they're at and just have a nice conversation to then rise above the situation. Words have so much power. So choose the words you use, but also the tone you use them with. Yes. So governance was the word that's jumped out at you. How do you, I guess it's Zeus really that you're wanting to talk about that with the governance.
Yeah, the archetype of Zeus. We may be one of the only channels talking about this at this full moon too. But Zeus, as we will show again, as mentioned before, with the T square, with the Grand Cross rather, is very prominent. But the word governance comes from the Greek word kubernaein and the Latin verb gubernare, both of which mean to steer or to pilot. It kind of reminds me of a ship's captain, or a farmer who's steering his flock or steering his dogs around to make sure that the animals are in the right place. But that's where it originally came from. And I like to sometimes go back to the etymology of words, to establish where they started and how they've evolved. So the words, or the word governance, which we know today, and this is governance. Perhaps we can put that word on the screen, governance, as opposed to government. But yeah, to steer or to pilot is the original meaning of the words. The word was then adopted into the Old French as gouverner, and then in the Middle English, where it came to mean control, influence, and regulate. And the term governance is often used interchangeably with government, but the two are actually very different. Government is a set of control structures established by laws and constitutions. Governance is the behavioral relationship between the governed and the governors. It can also refer to the process of decision making and how decisions are implemented. Command and control, dictatorial decisions, crowdsourced, bottom-up consensus or groundswell decisions, two very different ways of looking at governance and government. Government tends to be top-down, command and control. Governance tends to be crowdsourced, bottom-up consensus and groundswell when it comes to decision making. But we're affected as humans individually and collectively, of course, by both structures, government and governance. Governance is a structure or process that allows an organization, a social organization, a collective, if you like, to steer itself. In some businesses, there are no managers. There's a flat structure, for example, and teams will be self-governing. This is one example of more of a consensus, more empowered way of making decisions, either individually and collectively. And governance relates to self-regulation as opposed to centralized control. The word governance has come to mean, and governance and government have been mixed and mingled, and I think that's a distinction that needs to be drawn out here, and we talked a lot about that in the last blog with Sagittarius and Gemini and the words. But the big issue with governance that affects all of us is about the collective commons. That is our shared resources. And these are things like water, air, earth, critical infrastructures, knowledge even. I mean, who owns the internet, for example, and who owns all of that knowledge? And there's a big fight over all of these things. Defence forces, policing, education, healthcare, social welfare, taking care of those that are not able to take care of themselves. Excuse me, governance is one of the 5 branches of philosophy. And I remember when I first started looking into astrology, I stumbled into philosophy. And I came to realize that actually a lot of the Sagittarian thinking, we talked about this last time, that Sagittarian is the arc of human intellectualism that is the pinnacle of thinking. It often comes out of academia. It comes out of deep and learned study of philosophy, of history, of anthropology, of sociology, of religion, of mysticism. When all of that is put together in that Gemini space and it comes together as a philosophy, as a system of thinking, that is the Sagittarian energy. And of course, opposite this full moon in Gemini is the sun, as you mentioned, is still in Sagittarius. So we're still dealing with the ideas of the philosophical systems that we are governed by, or we allow ourselves to be governed by. And governance is one of those 5 branches. The other branches of philosophy, by the way, that underpin the worldview, whether we consciously recognize this or not, the worldview is determined in these 5 branches of philosophy. And this goes all the way back to the Greco-Roman days and even before. The great thinkers have been thinking about sort of 5 areas. One is epistemology, and that is our origins. And that's coming up again and again and again. You know, the more that anthropologists, for example, discover hieroglyphics in caves, and they discover remnants that have been buried under floods and layers and layers of sediment, all sorts of things like that going on across the world. That is about our origins, like who are we? Where do we come from? And that's a big part about governance. If we understand our origins, then we can begin to understand why governance is so important. Metaphysics is another branch of philosophy. And again, this is the Sagittarian energy of collective thinking. Metaphysics is the nature of reality. Logic is another part of the philosophical system, that the worldview, regardless of language, regardless of culture, these principles drive Sagittarian philosophy. So I've talked about epistemology, origins, and metaphysics, the nature of reality, and logic, which is reasoning and thought. Aesthetics is another branch of philosophy, or the Sagittarian worldview. And aesthetics is the study and appreciation of art. And the fifth part of that, of course, is governance, which is often interchanged with ethics and values. So the questions at this new moon, full moon, are how we allow ourselves individually and collectively to be governed. This affects us in the home. It affects our communities. It affects us at a country level, at a state level, at a nation level, at a continent level. When you think about the EU, there's a lot of questions right now going on there about governance. And the question also, from a behavioral perspective, for us all to ponder and consider at this full moon is, what are the virtues, values, and morals that we expect from our governors, from those people that are in power? And bear in mind that they are not always elected. Sometimes these are self-appointed people. Are we as humanity and are we as individuals acting empowered? Are we acting as self-sovereign? Are we acting autonomously and with agency? Or, Gemini, are we acting disempowered? Are we acting like subjects, objects to be moved around by an overseer or lord or ruler as they see fit? How are we thinking about and dealing with ethical dilemmas, such as what is acceptable and unacceptable within these governance structures? And how do we individually and collectively deal with unacceptable conduct and the consequences of that? You see, there's a few people make the decisions on behalf of the many. Is that really sustainable? Is that really reflecting everyone's view? And how do we talked the other day about an example of, say, digital democracy, where and this was with respect to our local council who bought some electric buses. And remember, we were talking about this, and I said an example of turning the whole situation around would be if a referenda was run on the phone and every single member of the community from, say, a certain age was asked to give an up-down vote on whether to buy electric buses that was costing millions and millions of dollars of collective funds. This is this collective commons I'm talking about. As opposed to a few elected councillors, 3 or 4 people sitting in a room and making a decision that affected, in this case, 45,000 people. So this is what we're talking about, is how engaged are we in this process? But the Gemini energy, just to wrap this bit up, is about talking about this. It is about beginning a discourse. It's about engaging in the public square and opening a debate. And it's not going to be easy. You know, Gemini is very polarized. There are very strong views about a lot of these things, especially when it comes to leaders and rulers and lords and kings and royalty and presidents and priests. There's enormous amount of human energy behind all of this. But at this full moon, and in fact for the year, the theme is face it. At a community level, it starts in the home. Who's the ruler in the house? Who's the governor in the house? Why is that? That's where it starts. And then look at the family, look at the school systems, look at the community before we even think about governments and presidents and politicians.
And have your cup half full so that you're open for other people's perspective. You know, we tend to be in these echo chambers where you tend to just be attracted to people with a very similar worldview as yourself. And then when there is an election and the opposite party wins, you're like, but I only know people who would have voted for the other political party. And it's like, if you're just living in this little bubble, then You just don't understand how other people are thinking. Anyway, open communication. So a grand cross. So we at a full moon, we have the sun on one side with the moon opposite. So the sun in Sagittarius and the moon in Gemini at this full moon. And in the astrological chart, when something makes a 90 degrees angle with something, that's called a square. And so we have a beautiful actual full square on the chart now, where we have the sun, moon, and then in the left corner, we have Chiron. And on the opposite side of Chiron, we have Zeus conjunct Arcturus. So that's the Grand Cross. And what is the message for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's visually, obviously, we could only see this on a computer program, but to think that the universal intelligence, the cosmos, the guardians, whoever is arranging all of this for us, certainly not humans. Uh, they've got a sense of humor, or they wanted to send a strong message. And that's why we don't often see grand crosses in astrology. And to have one on the very first reading in the full moon, the very first, it kind of sets the scene, yeah. But I like also, just before I talk about a little bit, just briefly about the grand cross, I like what you said there about the echo chamber. That's a good word, actually, and a phenomenon that we could see a lot of. There are a lot of echo chambers, especially in social media. And to be clear, governance is not just simply about politics. It's anywhere where there is somebody who's in a position of rulership where we are deferring to that person. And that's why I mentioned that can be totally appropriate, right? They may be an expert, they may be more wise, they may legitimately have that position of power, whether it be formal or informal. And it doesn't, the review and the thinking and the discourse about governance doesn't mean we throw out the baby with the bathwater. It just simply means we have a think about these things and we think about you know, is that person reflecting back to us our collective virtues and values? And that's the key. That's the ethical part of all of this. And, especially if you then multiply that up, but it always starts in the family and it starts in usually in these smaller groups is where we see these dynamics beginning to play out. But the Grand Cross is, there's so much going on. I'm just going to briefly touch on each of the astrological archetypes very briefly. And if you'd like to know more, then I encourage you to go back and listen to some of our content or pop some questions in the comments, and we would love to take that further with you. Arcturus is one part of this Grand Cross. Arcturus represents perspective. Pallas Athena represents being strategic and savvy and smart. The sun, and I've talked about that, the sun in Sagittarius, is our collective and individual philosophy about governance. What do we believe and how do we act on those beliefs? We spend a whole blog talking about how those beliefs begin in childhood and begin in those formative years and then solidify and culminate in a philosophical or cultural perspective, something that we hang our hats on often. And you see that very much in cultures. You see that in sports, which are incredibly tribal, and there's a belief system that's just brought together, and that is Sagittarius in action. What effect does collectivism therefore have on our self-confidence? Are we borrowing our confidence from the fact that we are part of a lineage or part of a political group or part of a movement that's so-called winning right now? And do we lose confidence because we're part of a group or a team? Let's take sports as a metaphor and an analogy of this. Are we on the winning team or the losing team? See, often when we ascribe our confidence and we identify with these leaders who are in governance, then if they're not winning, or we perceive that they're not winning, or they've failed, we can also feel like we've failed. And yet that is, when you think about that, doesn't make any sense. But this is where humanity is at. We've given away so much of our power to these groups, to these philosophies, to these collective ideas that we've lost ourselves in all of that. And that's really what the sun is bringing forward. Chiron represents this as an existential crisis in humanity. We are at a crossroads. Chiron is where we have been cut off from our intuition. We distrust our intellect, and therefore we give away our power and let somebody else do the thinking on our behalf. This is often, and we go back to those branches of philosophy, thinking and reason and logic is a part of the philosophical system. If we don't have the confidence to think for ourselves, we will let others do the thinking for us. So Chiron is bringing that existential crisis to the surface here. And this is where, as a collective, we have allowed, and we all have done this, individually and collectively, we have allowed unethical, dominant individuals, the loudest voice often, to assume governance positions. The moon represents our soul memories, our individual and collective trauma that permeates through the subconscious into our awareness, often as feelings of fear and anxiety, as discomfort. We shy away from perhaps discussions like this because in a soul level, at a gut level, we may well have gone through this process before in another life, in another dimension, in another timeline, and we weren't successful. And so we have a memory of that. And that is our moon and the Chiron coming together as an existential knot that needs to be unraveled, Gemini, with communication and awareness. So the moon, those collective unconsciousness about governance, is deeply rooted in humanity's past. We have fears and imbalances and apprehension about giving away our power and then taking it back. And this is pervasive. And these governance structures, which have become government, that lock us up in rules that go against our best interests, are because we are giving away our power and we've stopped thinking. Zeus, and I mentioned before, the archetype of Zeus is presidents, priests, politicians, generals, and CEOs, and we are being asked to look at their conduct and their behavior. Mars influence here, there's so many archetypes, and this is why it's a grand cross. But Mars is the archetype of the strong man or woman who is dominant, who is assertive, who is aggressive. So when we think of the context of presidents, priests, politicians, generals, and CEOs, we are unwittingly, and in many cases, you and I were talking about this before in preparation for this blog, and we were talking about how many strong men there are on this planet right now. And they've risen to positions of power, and they are claiming that they will solve these existential crises and that they are the saviors. Well, this is this Mars energy, because remember, we talked about Mars and the archetype is Mars is the archetype of the warrior, the hero, the king. So we are seeing a lot of that energy coming through, the strong man or woman who is dominant, assertive, aggressive, militant, warmongering, combative. I won't name names on here other than to say, look to the Middle East, look to the United States, look wherever you want to look, and you will see examples of this. These individuals are riding the wave of our disempowerment as humanity, our deep existential fears, and our lack of confidence individually and collectively that we can do things on our own, we can stand on our own 2 feet, we can self-manage. Because they've told us, these leaders, these rulers, they've told us that, oh, no, look, you can't do it, you're disorganized, you're all over the place, humanity. and we'll do it for you. And this is how the sleight of hand, this is this existential Chiron moon energy coming together in this grand cross. So we need to be aware that there are heroes, saviors, and warriors that are apparently willing to fight on our behalf. All we have to do is give them the mandate, our vote, our power, our money, our energy. And Vesta, in the middle of all of this, who we've not talked a lot about, but is so important here. Vesta is meditation and mindfulness. This energy is where we are existentially on the moon side in the memories and Chiron. We are cut off from our direct connection to source, our soul families, and the universal intelligence. And Vesta is saying, reconnect with our inner compass, our North Star, our guiding principles, our inner virtues and values, our original state before we were distorted by some really bad decisions individually and collectively that go through the generations ever since humans came onto this planet. There's been a lot of things that we have made a decision to do. There's a lot that's happened to us, but there's a lot that we've also acquiesced to and given up on. And Vesta is about meditation and mindfulness. In other words, finding the opportunity in the middle of all of this noise to go inward and to listen to our inner compass and to listen to our inner voice and to reconnect with source consciousness, with the universal intelligence, whatever your experience of this is, but getting outside of ourselves and going back to our origins, epistemology, and finding a connection with who we really truly are. And that is what the Grand Cross involves. There's just so many energies there, but the only way to break it down was to do it piece by piece.
Yes, and I'm glad that you brought Vesta, brought her out at the end. If you haven't heard of the myth of Vesta, please look it up. It is beautiful. And you can connect with that what is outside of you or even inside of you, some of us believe, is any moment of the day. You know, you're in the garden and you just admire how the flower has just come to be, or you open the curtain and the rainbow is there, and just taking those few seconds to recognize that, and that there is just more than just a 3D head down, earning your bacon for the week. There is so much more, and sending out that frequency with you, right? What I said about earlier about it's how do we communicate? Do we bring ourselves and those around us down, or are we able to be uplifting? Because I believe in karma, or the boomerang, what you send out will come back. And so the more good you send out, the more good will come back. So how would you summarize it all, bring it all together, David?
Yeah, and everything we think or say or do multiplies and comes right back to you. That is one of my philosophical views about, how I keep my ethical, my moral compass in place. And that's something I learned as a child, and I remember reading it somewhere. Everything you think or say or do multiplies and comes right back to you. And it kind of acts as something as simple as that. This illustrates what we talked about in the last blog and here as well, is that I learned that as a child, in other words, in my Gemini experience, the Gemini formative years. And it's arced into a philosophical view. It's a very short, pithy, strong view, but it anchors me. It's my North Star. That keeps me, among others, that keeps me really centered and coming back to center Vesta. It allows me to both have a frame of reference through which and a lens through which I can judge my own behavior, assess and interpret my own behavior, but also assess and interpret others. And it allows me to hold myself to a standard of behavior that I expect those in governance to also exhibit. but yet we don't see that. If people were living by the values of everything that we think and say and do multiplies and comes right back to you, we would see a very different world. So that is Gemini and Sagittarius in a very practical sense. But governance is also about how we govern ourselves. And that is the illustration of what that little story that I've just shared is what it's about. So governance is both out there, but it's also in here. And effectively, what we are talking about is rulers, controllers, directors, leaders, managers, presidents, kings, all symbolized by Zeus. And there's not a one of us on this planet, there's not a one of us listening to this or watching this who is not in a relationship with a ruler or controller or director or leader, a manager, a president, a king. There is not a one of us who doesn't interact with the archetype of Zeus. Now, we haven't touched on it here, and I'll just briefly say that there's another archetype of leadership, and it's Kronos, which we touched on last time. But Kronos is tyrannical rulers and leaders. Zeus is more of a collaborative way of seeing this lens of rulership and control and guidance. It's that there's slightly different takes on this whole concept, and this isn't involving this full moon does not involve Kronos, but we keep in mind that Kronos is tyrannical rule. So the question, therefore, as we wrap this up, is how do we arrange ourselves into a cohesive, self-managing community? Now, this isn't a global community. This may be just, it might be just a team at work. It may be a sports team that you're a part of. It may be a social group. It may be a digital group where you have connections online all over the world. See, boundaries in a world without walls is limitless. And of course, Gemini is about the media and is about communication. So we ask ourselves at this full moon, and full moons are about revelation and realization. The moon is at its apex. Everything can be seen. This is why this idea of everything can be seen around these rulers. Decisions are made, rules are changed, conduct is managed, consequences are enforced. All of these are issues of governance. How are decisions made? How are rules changed? How is conduct managed? The Gemini, Mars, and Sun combination in Sagittarius is loud, it's abrasive, and it's divisive. The Sagittarian Sun being where it is about our collective and individual position on governance. Gemini, on the other side, is about choice. Unfortunately, in this case, unlike Ophiuchus, which is about more integrative energy, or Aquarian, which is much more about perspective, but this, as is Arcturus, obviously, as I mentioned before, but Gemini is very binary. So to some extent, this is about choices. We are part of the problem, or we are part of the solution. The context, and I mentioned before, for governance often, but not exclusively, is about the collective commons. That is our shared resources, and there is tremendous endeavor and fighting and good and bad around the collective commons, and that is the battle over and the conflicts to do with shared resources such as water, such as air, earth, infrastructure, knowledge, healthcare, education, social welfare, defense, judiciary, policing, and taxes. We, humanity, have allowed, and you used the word before, Sana, and I've stolen it. We've allowed middlemen, priests, presidents, politicians to do our bidding, to be our overlords, to guide us, to be our mouthpiece and our advocates. But we've done that in many cases unwittingly and unconsciously. And in fact, a lot of these individuals are self-serving. And we only find out later on But at this full moon, we're going to see some of this come to light. Vesta is encouraging us to go inwards, to rediscover our inner fire and to connect with the divine intelligence so that we can overcome the existential crisis that is separation and alienation from our creative force, Chiron. Ultimately, if we allow these middlemen, these structures, these unelected in many cases, people to assume a role of governance over us, if we allow this to continue and don't question it, then how are we ever going to move forward as humanity? And that is why I think that this is the theme for 2025. It is the word governance.
I look forward to sitting here in 12 months' time and see how perhaps the governance on this planet has changed dramatically. Wouldn't that be nice? In a positive way, obviously. Thank you so much, David, for sharing your knowledge. And I love that we really look at lots of planetary bodies in the night sky. You know, it's not just the sun, moon, Saturn, Jupiter. But we spoke about Arcturus and Zeus. We even mentioned Vesta. And there's just so much more than the smaller group of archetypes that a lot of other astrologers talk about. And of course, we only look at where they are in the true night sky, not on this 12 signs, 30 degrees each. It's not true. So if this resonated with you, please share our content with your friends and family. We love to connect as many people as possible. And if you were curious of where your sun was at your time of birth and some of the other planetary bodies, please hit us up for a chat or a reading. You can listen to us on Spotify and Apple Podcast. And if you have any questions, drop a comment below. David, any parting messages?
No, that's it. I just a namaste and thank you for listening. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time.
Namaste. Until next time.